Thank you very much, everybody, for coming, and thanks to the library for hosting us. When I was growing up, I wonder if I'm alone in this, there were 4 places in Ireland, there may have been a 5th, but I can't think of what it was, that had a special glamour for summer Sundays around the 15th of August. One was Courtown, which was not like any other beach on the Wexford coast. It was filled with amusements, with pongo, with bingo, with chair planes, with crowds of people in the car park. The other was Ballybunion, and the other was, help me with Sligo, what's that called?
Enniscrone.
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 Bundoran was beautiful, Bundoran. And Strand Hill was, and they were different to the other ones, which often just had bare beaches and one little shop. These had loads of things, and they were very exciting if you were young. And we had a relative who would just drive in from the country on a Sunday into Courtown, and she wouldn't get out of the car because there was so much excitement just in the car park with people coming and going that she just sat there and commented on people, and that was her Sunday. So obviously the one I haven't mentioned is Tramore, which had the same sort of glamour and was built probably in the 50s based on some American ideal. And of course it struck none of us that there was a life there in the winter, and indeed in the summer itself, that was not the life of just coming on a Sunday to enjoy the beach and enjoy the amusements, but there was an inner world of it. I suppose the first question I want to ask you before you just read us a bit of the book is, did you ever think about not naming it? And in naming it, in calling it Tramore, what sort of energy do you think extra energy you got from it?
Yeah. Well, I felt that it would be really recognisable to people as Tramore because there's so many landmarks that are named in the novel. Once you say the Metal Man, then people know this is Tramore, or you say Brownstown Head or the racecourse, that actually there was no point in not naming it, and that was it. But yeah, you're right, there are so many seaside towns that are similar to Tramore. It's an old Victorian town like Bray or Salt Hill, so the prom there is a Victorian prom, and so yeah, it just felt totally recognisable to me, but the history goes way back. You're quite correct, in the 1950s was where the dance halls and the amusement park and all of this would have started out then, but actually the Victorians were the ones who used it as a health spa, and a steam train line was built from Waterford City to bring the moneyed Victorians out, and they had bathing boxes in Tramore on the Strand. So the history goes way back before, and I was very conscious of that. And I also named maritime tragedies that happened in Tramore that couldn't have happened anywhere else. So I was quite comfortable naming it, and yeah, the whole point was that it was in Tramore for me.
So it's not a fictional Irish town, it's emphatically those streets and that light and that Waterfordness.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I did take some poetic licence.
Did you?
Oh, absolutely.
What?
What a relief. You know, otherwise it would have been completely non-fiction. But no, I did. And what that was around was, you know, I needed shops to happen in streets where there were no shops and streets to happen in places where there were no streets. So people in Tramore would say, there's no butchers there. You know, there's always somebody who would. And the other thing was that, you know, I mean, I was born in Waterford, but I'm not from Tramore. And people in Tramore call the amusements down around. They don't call it the amusements, which I didn't know until after the book was published.
Down round.
Down round. We're going down round. In Waterford City, they call it the amusements, but you know if you're talking to a local because they say we're going down round. Yeah. It's the Marys in Cork. Everyone here knows that. So, yeah.
Can you read us a bit of the book, please?
Yeah, I'll read from the beginning, Colm, because apart from when I'm in Waterford, I feel like I'm better to read from the beginning because it gives you the introduction to Tramore. And I wanted this to work as though you had just arrived into the town. Almost, we were talking about drones earlier, like a drone bird's eye view of the town in the off-season. So I'll start at the beginning. Tramore, population 6,101. It was the off-season and the local youngsters were up to no good in Tip Phelan's caravan park. He wasn't about to begrudge them a few flagons in the dunes until he got a phone call from the Garda sergeant telling him a bad element was hanging around. Would he consider installing security cameras or a couple of Alsatians? That was the way with the guards. They'd make a suggestion, and if you ignored it, you'd be done for tax or speeding or any else shite. The call would have to be acted on. But you're only courting trouble with dogs and cameras, so Tip put a small ad in the Irish Independent instead. Wanted, caretaker to live rent-free by the sea. He was known as Tipperary because the only song he ever sang was Sliabh na Mán. In the back room of the Grand on a Saturday night, nobody would deny he had a voice. There was a want in it that could only be understood by men, since it afflicted them alone, an unassailable scourge for which there was no end or cure. Whenever he cleared his throat to sing, a shut-up to fuck swept over the bar. Hush, 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 all the way down to the lounge. Tip closed his eyes tight against the silence and began. Alone, all alone by the wave-washed strand, and alone in a crowded hall. The hall it is gay and the waves they are grand, but my heart is not here at all. His real name was Michael Phelan, but nobody in Tramore, apart from his wife, Verona, knew it. She called him Tip anyway, and he called her V or VP when they were alone, and she gave him the look, knowing it would drive him demented. They could be at it half the night, and often they were. The next day he'd be addled with desire and a profound ache in his bones. Early on in the marriage, when he was still hurling, he'd sleep out of temptation's way in the spare room, a measure he was forced to take after a bionic all-nighter left him in ribbons for the county final. The sentiment on the sideline was that he'd been brutal, and they took him off at half-time. But the match was beyond salvation. Oh, V was lethal all right, or at least she had been before the twins came along. These days, she was indifferent to him. It was like living with a cat. When she wasn't changing the babies, she was nursing them. One on each nipple, their little fat legs kneading her stomach like it was dough. She was exhausted, destroyed. He begged her to patch things up with her mother, for the love of God. Verona bundled her breasts back into the sling she'd taken to wear in place of a bra and zipped her fleece up to the chin. Hell will freeze over, she said, before I talk to that bitch again. 22 people applied for the caretaker job. Tip ruled out 17 immediately on the grounds of age, criminality and Englishness. Of the 5 that remained, 4 hung up when they heard the position was unpaid. The 5th was a musician from Dublin. His accent was thicker than tar. I could do with the headspace. The payphone swallowed another 20 pence on him. Do you know what I mean? Tip knew exactly what he meant. The place is yours, he said. The musician arrived at the weekend with a hold all over his shoulder and a guitar in one hand. The other one he extended in a handshake that was too solid to be sincere, his dark eyes holding Tip's gaze for longer than was necessary. Dahi was his name, and he was idling around the 30 mark with the matted brown hair and the makings of a ginger beard. He wore a hoop in one ear and a scrap of black silk knotted around his throat, an affectation that left itself dangerously open to interpretation. But he had the strut of a man who wouldn't take any lip, and they agreed if there was trouble, he was to phone Tip. If there wasn't, he was to leave him alone. With the musician keeping an eye on the caravan park and the guards off his back, all Tip had to worry about now was getting through the next few months without the comfort of Verona. Her plan was to dedicate herself body and soul to the twins, while he took care of the older child, a boy of almost 4, who tornadoed around the house, taking swipes at balled-up socks and baby toys with a hurley that couldn't be prized from him. It was like a stick grafted onto the end of his chubby arm. He had the energy of 6 children, and the school wouldn't take him for another year. So there was nothing for it but to run him up and down the length of the Strand until he surrendered to tiredness and fell asleep in his booster seat on the drive back home. Tip was pucking a tennis ball up and down the beach for the child the first time he saw the girl. She was walking arm in arm with the musician, her red hair aloft in the onshore wind. He watched them stride across the boulder bank in their long coats. At the dunes, the musician took the girl's hand and pulled her onto the sandbank. He held her hair between his fingers and kissed her face. A moment later, they vanished through a gap in the marram grass to continue their canoodling in the caravan park. Tip imagined the girl lying on the faded candlewick bedspread, her skin lilac from the cold, her hair tangled and smelling of the sea. The tide lapped its way up the shore. The child still had an hour, maybe 2 of devilment in him. It was going to be a long night.
Wow, that's great. Did you feel that Tramore was a landscape? I mean, an emotional landscape as well as a place that was just utterly undescribed. It was not in anything that you were reading, and that therefore you had a sudden space to put a flag up over.
Yeah, that's exactly how I felt, Colm. But I have to be straight up here. I had read William Trevor's short story Honeymoon in Tramore about 8 years ago. And it's an extraordinary story.
Could you tell us about the story?
Yeah, so this story was probably published around 1960, I think, in America first. And it's the story of a farmhand called Davy Toome, who is boarded out from an orphanage in Cork City to the countryside into a family at 15. And he falls in love instantly with the farmer's daughter, Kitty. And for the next 15, 17 years is admiring her from afar, but he's a hired help into the house. The mother is dead. And then Kitty gets herself into trouble with this local gadabout, Coddy Donegan, I think is his name. It's a great name. And someone has to take the blame because Coddy isn't stepping up to the plate at all. So Davy is called upon, first of all, to go into Minogue's chemist in Cork City and to an abortionist. And Kitty says, no, I can't do this. So now someone has to be found to marry her. And Davy is the person who's going to marry her. So she decides we'll go to Tramore on our honeymoon. And they arrive at the boarding house in Tramore. Kitty is showing. Immediately, Mrs. Hurley, who's the landlady of the boarding house, cops on what's happening. And then what happens is the first night of their honeymoon, and we see how much he's been cuckolded into the situation. But that story, to me, was the first time I'd ever heard Tramore being mentioned in fiction. It was a town I knew quite well, you know, and I thought, my God, how has nobody else written about this place? Now, Trevor's story is so vivid. In fact, now when I reread it, I realise it's been a huge influence over so many aspects of the Amusements. But at the time, I thought no one has ever written a short story about Tramore other than him. I'm going to give it a go. And I mean, this was about 7 or 8 years ago. So I wrote a short story called The Court Order about a father who gets a court order access to his son at weekends and takes him from Dublin down to Tramore for the weekend. It was shortlisted for the Bath short story competition. And I loved writing it so much. And it was the first time I'd been published that I thought, I must be good at writing about Tramore. I'll give this another go. And so I wrote another story which appears in the Amusements, and it's St. Otteran's. It's the chapter where Helen is a little girl and is taken into St. Otteran's to visit her father, who's drying out in the county mental hospital. So that story was the one that won the Harper's Bazaar competition. And so it was the origin story, and I think a lot of writers work that way, you know, so that was the origin story for the Amusements, and that gave me Helen. And I had all these questions in my head about the little girl from that story. You know, how did her life turn out? Did she get married? Did she have kids? Did she go to college? Who was her best friend? And I started just answering those questions by building a life for her in Tramore, and that's how it came about. But I'm really indebted to William Trevor's short story, absolutely.
I suppose there's nothing worse than another writer telling you that you have a problem, but you do. You have a problem, which is that you have a natural ability to write comedy. I mean, even the bit, I mean, you sort of glossed over it when you read it. Anyone else would have stopped to get a laugh. And
the Englishness.
No, I mean, 22 people applied for the caretaker job. Tip ruled out 17 immediately on the grounds of age, criminality, and Englishness. You just go, okay. And I mean, oh yeah, there's a wonderful description. I mean, just casual. It's just there. It doesn't. The work it's doing is to add detail, but it doesn't just do that. It stops you for a second, thinking. At the far, this is in the arcades. Evie yanks the slot machine arm and squeals whenever it stops on Three of a Kind. At the far end, an old biddy in slippers and a thrift store cardigan is feeding her state pension into a poker machine. And you just go, oh. And another example. On 34, there's a wonderful detail about photos. You know, you put in photos to be developed, and then you don't come to collect them. And it says, but I'd need a camera and film, and I'd have to get it developed down the kiosk. You would. And if I didn't pay and collect the photos in time, Midge Maguire would stick them in the shop window under unclaimed photograph sign for the whole town to see. So just the image of that in any small town. Oh, my God. But then on the opposite page, I watch you almost deciding I'm not a comedian. I'm not writing a comic novel about this comic place. I'm doing something much more serious, and I need to check myself regularly to stop making jokes, however good, to see if there's something else I can get from this territory. And you go, this sentence, that January, like every January, a sea mist hung over the town, and it was dark by 4:30. And again, that sentence was it was dark by 4:30. Just watch the rhythm of that. That January, like every January. So you're suddenly back into another world of generations, of seasons, of things happening again and again. And also of this place as a deserted village. As much as it is fun in the summer, it's deserted in the winter. So that I can watch you all the time in this book, playing a game with yourself between how funny some of the book is, and then there's a much darker edge, and then there's a much darker core. So I suppose this is a long question, and I have to come to the question part, which is, how I'm not going to even ask you how conscious you were, but I mean, this is something you were obviously working with, this idea of your own skill writing comedy and your own skill at actually finding a darker thing and trying to match them and put them together.
Yeah, I think lightness and shade are really important. I mean, I don't write with the reader in mind, but I am conscious of writing something. There's a lot of darkness and there's quite a bit of death in this book. But I suppose the challenge for me and what I wanted to do was have dark humour, a gallows humour that goes along with it. For me as a writer as well, to be sitting there working with that material, it was really important. But you're right, you have to pull back from it. You can't go for kind of cheap laughs. And sometimes... But the seasonality comes into it as well, because when you look at these seaside towns, to me they're very theatrical, and there's always the comedy and the tragedy going on at the same time in them. So in the winter time, it's a very bleak place, and I had this theatrical idea of pulling back the curtain in the winter and seeing the rigging behind it, the empty caravan park, and the amusement park with just the skeleton of the roller coaster in it, and all of this. The visuals in seaside towns, and in Tramore in particular, are so strong. And there's memorials there to tragedies at sea. Some of them modern, some of them very old. So there's a lot of death and a lot of tragedy there. But then in the summertime, the circus pull in, and it's the amusements, and it's all, sort of sandcastles and buckets and those little windmills and candy floss. And so I suppose there is kind of a dissonance that I wanted. And that is probably reflected in the humour. And the tragedy. It was important to have that, but I wasn't hugely self-conscious about it. It came quite naturally.
Okay.
Yeah.
I suppose the idea then that as a protagonist in this book, Tramore is playing the part of the protagonist, and you then have to start working on the idea you don't want your characters to be typical people in a typical place. In other words, it's the unusual nature of Tramore that you're interested in, and then you become interested in the strangeness of any of the characters you're dealing with, of how you have to give them very, very precise characteristics that are not part of some overall pattern, that they're not just the butcher or some widow living alone or the daughter, that they actually have a huge amount, I suppose what we might call a rich life.
Yeah.
And what I wonder is, how did you begin to map the book? Or did you just write the book?
No, it was really, there's two things there. First of all, the issue of character. I do think it is a character-driven novel. So when it came to the structure of it, because it is an unconventional structure, I mean, to me, it's a very modernist structure. I don't believe that the story could have been told with a 3-act structure. It's polyphonic, it's episodic, and there are lots of, people have questioned whether this are short stories. And I'm always no, they're not short stories, because they'd be very poorly written short stories. I'm kind of defending the short story more than the novel when I say that. Because, the economy, and I've written short stories that you need for a short story, and it has to be completely self-contained. You cannot just have characters walking in and out of your short stories for no reason. And there had to be the forward momentum. For me, is that the reader wants to know what happens to these characters. Do they meet again? Do things work out okay for them? And do the bad guys, because there's a couple of them, do they get their comeuppance? And that sort of pathos was really important to me. And you don't have room for that in a short story. That's the work of a novel, so that's where the structure came in. But then the problem was threading, because there are 2 main characters, Helen and Stella, in the novel, but there's maybe 14 other characters that sort of, they're satelliting, or they're, that they're around. And so they all have their own storylines. So they had to follow through from the beginning right through to the end. So I don't know how many redrafts I did. I mean, there was just it was dozens, I think. But what I did, I painted my kitchen with blackboard paint and bought a huge thing of chalk. And I'd stand in the kitchen at all hours of the day.
Hold on. Start slow. You did what?
I couldn't. I don't know. Post-its kept falling off the wall, and then I'd be like, oh, it's all after falling apart, and I don't know where it fell down. So I bought back blackboard paint and painted my kitchen with it, and got chalk, and I just started, kind of writing characters, and actually, and I'm terrible at maths, but Venn diagrams for where people's stories interacted. Yeah, my brother used to come around and he'd sit down, pour himself a coffee, and he'd be like, Jesus, we're all in for it in this book, aren't we? He'd call out the names of the chapters, who's that about, and all this kind of stuff.
And tell us how you began then. I mean, you began with the short story you mentioned.
With two stories.
Could you just take us through those?
Yeah. So the first one, as I mentioned, was St. Otterans, and that's Helen's character. Yeah. And the second one was a story, it's the New York chapter in the book, Kamikaze. And the way that came about was I wrote that story for the Francis McManus competition about 6 years ago maybe. It was much shorter. Obviously, the word count for that is 2,000 words. But there was something about it where I was like, this person is connected to Helen Grant. Who is it? And I'd, go for long walks. And I was like, she's her best friend. They grew up together. That's who she is. So as Kamikaze appears in this, it's twice the length. It's completely different to the way that it was as a short story. But it gave me Stella Swain. That's who the character was. So once I had them, I had to start populating their lives. Who are their brothers, who are the school teacher, who's the girl that kind of, the one that got pregnant in school and disappeared and came back, who were their mothers, which was really crucial because Stella's mother really is the antagonist in the novel. So it was all of that, really. Yeah.
The New York episode is really interesting because you get something that I haven't really read before, which is the difference between, say, an Irish pub and a New York bar, which is New York bars are very lonely places.
Yeah.
And they're open all day, and there are 3 or 4 losers at the bar, and they're sitting there, and no one quite knows why they're there, except they're drinking solidly.
Yeah.
And there's one person behind the bar, and it's a very strange experience to go into one of them.
Yeah.
With small New York bars, realising just how desolate it is. I think you captured that in that Kamikaze story.
I worked in enough of them, Colm.
Did you?
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
Did you
in the 90s, yeah.
Did you tell us about that?
Well, I was, the sort of Morrison visa generation, and so
could you explain Morrison visa?
Sorry, yeah, for all the very young people, Morrison visa. So the Donnelly and Morrison visas would have happened, I suppose, in the 80s and early 90s, where this was part of the lottery scheme for a green card, but there was a bias, a weighting towards Irish people, so if you applied, you were pretty much guaranteed to get a green card.
I actually met Bruce Morrison once, and I said, "Do you know in Ireland that you're the Morrison visa?
Oh yeah,
everyone talks about you as though you're a sort of a hero."
Yeah, he absolutely is. He was a hero.
So you went there.
Yeah, so I was working in bars there throughout my 20s. And so Kamikaze, this is really embarrassing, is actually based on my experience of being so naive that I got a job in a topless bar and didn't realise it. Yeah. It was only topless at the weekends, and I just got a job during the week. And I couldn't figure out why no one was coming in. And they were like, they kept saying to me, "You're going to work here on the weekends?" I was like, "I don't know." And they were like, "Well, we'll come back if you're here on the weekends." So eventually I copped on that the bras that were hanging around off the fans were the bartender's bras. So I left and got a job in a different bar.
We're all,
in a good Irish bar, where they sold the full Irish.
Where they food and showed GAA matches.
Yeah, no, they didn't show GAA matches, but you could get a full Irish and a Bloody Mary, and yeah.
But one of the things in the book that I think belongs to us all is that idea that all of us know of going back to your parents' house or going back to your mother's house when you've been away and you've been doing all these things to find everything the same and everything different, and you don't know what your role is. Yeah. Would you talk to us about that?
Well, I just think that's such a common experience for people. It wasn't my experience, actually, so that's not based on anything to do with me, but I do... it's in A Guest at the Feast, you talk about Enniscorthy in that way, that everything brings you back into it. Earlier we were talking about Adrian Duncan, and I spoke to Adrian recently about Longford. Adrian Duncan is an Irish writer who... really amazing writer. The Geometer Lebachowski is his latest novel, but I spoke to him recently.
Love Notes from a German...
Building Site.
Notes from a German Building Site is a really good book. Yeah. If you know an engineer... this is a book about an engineer. Yeah.
So he writes about engineering and the man-made environment, and yeah, landscape, but in a really interesting way, because he is actually a structural engineer. But in talking to him about writing about bogs and writing about just the landscape, he was saying that he doesn't feel like he's ever left his parents' house. His imagination has never left his parents' house in Longford. People will know him because he's written this non-fiction book about bungalow bliss, you know, that, yeah, so that's who he is. But he said to me, those aerial photographs that people could buy of their bungalows, that when he looks at the one that his parents bought, that all the themes and the preoccupations of his fiction are in that aerial photograph, which I found fascinating. It's, you know, the rick of turf, the old goalposts that he used to play football in, his father's home office. And he said, you know, it's amazing. He lives in Berlin now. You never leave this small area. And I think you were kind of saying the same thing about Enniscorthy. So I don't have that, but maybe Tramore is, you know, because I went there as a small child, but I didn't grow up there. But I certainly felt so familiar. It was it was something in my hardwiring was there when I wrote this book, you know.
And I think you're aware in the book as well of social differences, of tiny social differences between families becoming enormous as the mothers seek a better lives for their daughters. They shouldn't be hanging around with someone who's just at a smaller level on the ladder than them.
Yeah.
And but that must be true of Waterford as much as it's true of anywhere, really. You know?
Oh, I think it's true of everywhere. I mean, maybe it is a particularly Irish thing. In dealing with class, I mean, class is a big thing in the book. You know, I mean, my theme's really family and, I suppose, inherited ideas, inherited trauma, inherited begrudges and grief are things that I keep coming back to, you know. So in the Amusements, basically Stella is a middle-class girl who makes friends with a working-class girl who's Helen, and their mothers end up at war over a telephone bill. You know, one of them can afford to pay it and the other one can't. And of course, Stella's mother is looking down her nose on the grants because they have less money and because Helen's father is an alcoholic. But I suppose, you know, money is not evenly distributed, you know, whereas talent is, and Helen is the talented artist. But things don't work out for her because she's coming from a class where people don't have choice. You know, that it just takes a little bit of extra money, you know, to give you the choice to be able to get out, to make something of yourself. But she's in a class where it's, why would you go to college? And people have spoken to me about the mothers, and they feel that Helen's mother is really unfair, that she's, you know, an awful wagon. And I'm like, no, she's terrified that her daughter is going to be rejected by people who are a class above them, and that her life is going to be full of disappointment. And that's why she doesn't encourage her in her art. It's not because she doesn't love her daughter. It's her way of showing love is to tell her to stay in your lane, because if you go outside, I can't protect you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite important that you don't just decide to give her this great fame and success, that somehow or other she is being contained by this world. This world is still pulling her back no matter where she goes. Could you take us through other characters in the book, such as the butcher?
Oh, the butcher, yeah, the butcher. Actually, I love the butcher. So the butcher in the book is Ted Burke. And we meet Ted first because when Helen goes around to do her Leaving Cert art project, she decides to do a project called Greetings from Tramore, and she's going to go and photograph the local people, and then she's going to do portraits of them. And of course, nobody wants to be photographed because they're all camera shy. But Ted Burke, the butcher, says, oh yeah, and he gets all dressed up in his butcher's finery. She's disappointed because he's blood all over him when she comes in. So he puts on a nice clean coat and on the trilby and puts down the awning and he stands outside. That's the first time we meet him. But Ted Burke has this private life that we then find out about in another chapter called Love Comes Late around here. We discover that Ted is a widower, and that his interest in art goes across the arts, but he keeps it to himself because he doesn't want people to think he's pretentious, and he doesn't want his daughters laughing at him. And he has a great interest in musical theatre and opera, but he has nobody to go to the Theatre Royal with him. And so he starts fancying this local woman this woman who moves in locally, Vonnie Jacob, who's also in her 70s. And I really had fun writing this character because I loved the idea of giving these older people, getting them to fancy each other, you know, and giving them desire and all of the things that you so rarely read about in fiction. And so Ted has this kind of secret life where he lies in bed, you know, listening to Dame Kiri Te Konawa and fantasising about her and wants to go out with this local widow. And it's funny, with that chapter, somebody asked me, and I don't know if this is where you're going with it, whether Joyce had influenced it and whether Ulysses had influenced it, because, of course, it starts with him shaving, and it was like, oh, that's Buck Mulligan. And I was going, the honest-to-God truth is I only read Ulysses this year. And I'd love to say I was influenced by Joyce, but it was the first time I read Ulysses this year. It was my project for the year. And I kind of thought, my God, somehow this has gotten into my psyche when I was writing it. I don't know how, because I'd never read it. But I suppose I must have been exposed to it just through other readings. So that's who Ted is.
It's also sometimes the only time a man becomes fully self-conscious. At least theoretically, you know, I mean, maybe we all spend our time staring into the mirror, but we're not meant to. We're meant to just do it in the morning when you shave.
Yeah.
You know, so that idea of a man vaguely confronting himself, looking in horror at himself, if you're me, and shaving is actually the only time I will deal with a mirror in any given day. And the rest of the time I'll run, you know. And
you see, men don't really shave like that anymore. An older generation of men would. So I have this vision, definitely of my father, of my late father, who would always have shaved. Like, you wouldn't have the idea of him ever even having 5 o'clock shadow. But he would come out of the bathroom covered in toilet roll. Like with blood, you know, and I was like, how many years have you been doing this? You know, and it was, so I have Ted with this, you know, how many bits of toilet paper does he need? There's so much blood in him.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the ways in which your novel isn't like Ulysses is that there's so much street life in Joyce's book. The city is peopled, and the streets are peopled, but we very seldom get into anyone's house. Which is what makes the Molly Bloom sequence so interesting at the very end. But there's very little domestic life in the book. There's a great deal of pub life and street life and late night life. And but that what you're working with is the tension between the sort of, I suppose, the beach, the amusements, and then when someone closes their door, the actual silence and the secrecy that occurs inside domestic space versus people feeling they know each other or that everyone knows each other. And you think, everyone knows each other. No, they'd read my book, because they don't. Yeah. Once the door is closed, and therefore you have a sort of drama to play all the time, that this is happening in secret or this is happening in public. And you can work with both.
Yeah, I think you like, people are unknowable. And that's what I loved about some of these characters, the secret little interests or passions, and the secrets that they have as well from each other. I mean, the piece that I read to begin with, you know, Tip, this is where we meet Stella at the beginning. Tip Phelan sees Stella, and she's only 15 or 16 years old, and he hasn't slept with his wife since the twins were born. And he has this huge desire for her, which, of course, is, you know, a bit creepy, obviously, but he keeps it from Verona, from the wife, and he's ashamed of it, you know. So that's kind of his secret. But they all have it. They all have a secret. But you see, Colm, I feel that when you go into a seaside town, it's all jazz hands and candy floss, and here come the circus, and you know, and particularly somewhere like Tramore, because that's down on the prom. But there's a whole, what we call the top town in the book, a whole town in behind that where people live that we don't think about when we go into resort towns. And it could be in Spain, it could be in Portugal, it could be in Ireland. You just see what's there for the tourists. And so in the off season, that's when you see the locals, and that's when you meet them. And then behind that again, they go in behind their doors and what's happening in there. So to actually get through to people, you have to go through all of these, you know, doors essentially to get to what's really going on with them. And then they're self-deluded. So really, what's happening? Do we ever know what's going on with somebody?
Did you present the book, or did you launch the book in Tramore?
No, I didn't actually. I did it in Dublin. But the first reading, or the first event that I did, I was invited by a local writers group in Tramore to go into a pub, to Croke's pub in Tramore, upstairs, and read. I was so nervous. Jesus, I thought they were going to egg me. You know, I'd be drunk. So, but they were, you know, they were lovely. It was great, and I think that. Because I am a blow-in. My mother lives there. My mother, after my father died, moved down to Tramore, so I spent a lot of time there. She moved from Dublin back down there. She's not from there. She's from South Kilkenny. But so we spend a lot of... That's how I know it so well. But I have that benefit of being inside but on the outside. You know, I don't know anyone other than, you know, I've got an uncle in Tramore. My mother lives there. I don't know anyone else there. So to go into Croke's pub and do that event was really... It was great, yeah. I was happy they asked me. And
you have the world of the guest house to deal with as well, that whole idea of, again, someone running a space that's both public and private, that you can work with, in the same way as a shop almost, you know, that guest houses there. And
they're really useful for writers to have places that are public, public spaces where people come in and talk all the time, and what you can do. I mean, that was part of learning to write for me, really, was understanding that there are physical spaces that are very, very practical for a writer to use. And so the guest house is one of those, yeah. But also I realised afterwards I was going, oh, well, here we go, we're back to honeymoon in Tramore again. I realised all the references to the rashers and the sausages and the breakfast and what was going on in the guest house was very much, that was influenced by Trevor. But that chapter really is about, a travel writer coming to the town and giving a less than favourable review to Tramore and how the locals received this.
TripAdvisor sort of.
That kind of thing, yeah. And so that was the inspiration for it, because I do remember that happening and the locals being quite up in arms about it.
Did you read Winesburg, Ohio?
Yeah.
Could you tell us about that?
Yeah. So it was a long, long time ago that I read it. But so this is the idea of a composite novel. Sherwood Anderson, isn't it, wrote Winesburg, Ohio? Yeah. So and Elizabeth Strout or somebody else. It's the American tradition of taking many, many characters and having episodes and in small towns where they walk in and out of each other's lives. And I think Winesburg, Ohio is the first example of that happening. It's a young journalist, isn't it? I can't remember the details of it exactly, Colm. It's so long ago since I read it.
But they are sort of interlocking stories, and they're all centred around the same small place.
Yes, but in that case, the narrator of Winesburg, Ohio, is it's one character, but whereas I've got many, many different points of view. He's kind of he's observing what's going on, whereas this is quite different. I associate it more with the way that Elizabeth Strout writes. But when people talk about that structure, I think in Irish writing, I mean, The Green Road, Anne Wright's novel, is quite like that. Donal Ryan's books, very similar kind of structure as well, that it is this episodic.
You mean taking a single story or a single place and then bringing in a number of characters, rather than having an omniscient narrator or a single first person, you take 5 people or you take 5 perspectives, and you can come to the story in that sort of way. Yeah,
because I'm really interested in how people different points of view, because you can ask maybe this is my background as a journalist, where people will tell you the same story from 5 different points of view, and it has a very different complexion depending on who tells you it. And also in the idea of memory, I'm fascinated by how nobody remembers the same thing the same way. And there's a lot of that in the Amusements, even to the point where at the end of it, Stella doesn't remember that she never, ever invited Helen to her house, that Helen doesn't even know where the house is, even though they were friends for so long, And
the reader knows that so well.
That it was the snobbery. Yeah. She stays down in the estate. She doesn't come up here. But Stella doesn't remember. She has to tell her at the end how to get to the house, and they're in their 30s at that stage.
And what do you think same thing happened to me where I started as a journalist. And it's hard to know. Sometimes you think, I wanted to do the exact opposite of what I needed to do as a journalist. In other words, get my facts right, get the right length, meet the right deadline. But on the other hand, you learn to have a relationship to readers. In other words, this is being written for a reader. If it's not, an editor will tell you, I'm not publishing it, it's not being printed, because who's going to read it? And so you have 2 things. One, I want to get away from this. And B, I'm learning a lot from it as I'm going on. Did that happen to you?
That I'm learning a lot from...
That from journalism, from the whole idea of the immediacy of the relationship between writer and reader. Yeah.
I think journalism really helped me. That wasn't my experience, which you're describing, but there were other ways that it helped me. I realised, I write short. Most writers have this issue of writing loads and having to pare back, but as a journalist, I write really short. I edit as I go along. Now, I was a news editor, a radio news editor in Today FM for about 15 years, and that was very much about only what needs to be put into the news script, so you were just, and then also you're making decisions all the time as a news editor around what's your top story and what's the top line in a story, and it's constant because you're doing it every hour because it's radio. So I found that actually when it came to editing, that I probably didn't have the same, I wasn't as precious about it. I didn't need to be because I was paring back all the time anyway. And then I also wrote, like, I mean, I still write for the Sunday Independent, doing columns for them occasionally. But, you know, I wrote a restaurant review for about 12 years for the Irish Independent, and they gave me a huge poetic license. I was allowed to kind of write, you know, it was half it was about the people I went to dinner with. And this was during the Celtic Tiger. So it was really interesting in terms of observing the way that people were behaving in restaurants. For the first time, they had money, how they dressed, you know, their relationship with class and what it meant to be able to go out and splash out money and be seen in places. So it was really fun to write a restaurant column where I was observing what was happening around me. And I think that actually, I was writing creatively, even though at the time I wasn't consciously doing it. And that really, really helped me. So journalism was a great, yeah, it was a great help to me.
But it must be a relief now for you that you can write the book, you can invent characters, you can imagine moments, you can cut back on things, you can say winter came, no, spring came, autumn came, you can do anything you want, and that you don't have the next hour to have another news bulletin ready. There must be a lovely feeling about how you spend your day now.
Yeah, absolutely. And as well as that, there were columns that I was writing. And I remember the day I decided I'm done with this, I'd written a column and I'd written something in it where, through jigsaw identification, the person that I was writing about could have been identified. It was a story that I wanted to tell around children at the time when you were able to hit children in school. And it was this story, and then the editor rang me and said, this has been legaled, and you could actually identify the person you were talking about in this, which I realised. And I thought, I could just write a story about this. That's the way out, you know? And that's why I feel fiction, there are truths that you can put in fiction. I think sometimes non-fiction is much more dishonest than fiction.
Yeah.
You know, particularly personal essays, you know, where you're the worst, the most unreliable narrator of your own story, you know?
Are you going to go back to Tramore as a fiction writer?
I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm not sure they'd have me.
Thank you very much, Aingela Flannery. It's really very good of you to come.